we would love to. Good, good. Let me just start by saying that 4 groups have come together along with other stray groups and people to support the ICAN appeal here. And they are North Carolina Peace Action, Orange County Peace Coalition, Veterans for Peace, Eisenhower Chapter, and Triangle WILF, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. So we're very happy to have Seth here with us. And we'll just start by, we know he went to Chapel Hill because that's how he found us. So just fill us in, let us know what led you to ICAN and what you're doing.
Yeah, okay. I can answer all those questions for sure. And maybe as we go forward, it could just be, I didn't prepare anything to say, so we could just,
that's fine.
Especially because, I think both organizationally and individually, all of you are probably quite familiar with what we do, but so I don't want to belabor any points that you already know. But yeah, in the first place, and thank you for organizing this. It is pretty exciting for me to sort of connect the dots back to what, well, isn't my hometown, but at least a place where is quite near and dear to me is North Carolina. And I've been working with ICAN for years now, but and I've come to North Carolina in, as I've gone a lot of places to speak about ICAN and to speak about the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. But I didn't, I had never met many of you before, and I didn't know the work that you were doing in the cities in North Carolina specifically. So it's really cool to now meet the people behind some of the successes you've had there. And yeah, well, let's see. I'll talk about me. Real quick, I guess, in answer to your question and how I came to work with ICAN. My background was well, both in the arts and in law, and actually in Chapel Hill, I studied. I was in the best thing that they had in connection with peace studies, but it was the Peace, War, and Defense department, where I was taking my classes as an undergrad and then wrote a paper on nuclear weapons. But after graduating, this was right after the Cold War ended, and there weren't a lot of obvious places to take that kind of experience then, or maybe if I had connected with groups like yours at the time, things would have been different for me, but I didn't really know, how to take that forward. So I kind of went a totally different path and was doing a lot of music and art stuff and then law. But years later, I'm still following, the path of nuclear disarmament and, well, the path of nuclear disarmament not actually progressing in more of a less of a professional way, but just out of personal interest over these years. And I am at a certain point, I became a law professor, and I was teaching law and comparative law in a few other countries, and I was doing a year in Japan in 2016. Which is, my first trip to Hiroshima, and helped me, remember that that's what I really wanted to be working on. So I just found my way to ICAN for the negotiations of the TPNW, and that's how I got involved back at the UN. And I've been working on it ever since. And it's been quite a wild ride, of course, because we've just had this sort of, well, what I would consider a rather extremely fast series of successes, and a lot of crazy work to make it happen over these years, in terms of getting the treaty to get to negotiations, then getting the treaty negotiated throughout 2017, winning the Nobel Peace Prize, of course, in 2017, and then the treaty opening for signature in 2018, and working so hard to get those first 50 countries to ratify to bring it into force, which happened by October 2020, and then by January 2021, it did enter into force. So now we've spent the subsequent couple of years trying to both continue to universalize the treaty and then prepare for the first meeting of states parties, which happened last June in 2022 in Vienna. And now we're preparing for the second meeting of states parties, which will happen in November this year, 2023, this time in New York. And in the first meeting of states parties, we basically, the states adopted, but we were working on the action plan, basically, that was adopted and would sort of set in motion the intersessional processes under the TPNW to sort of operationalize and implement the treaty. So we've been working really hard on that ever since June. And ICAN is the official observer, the only NGO observer, along with the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, that is formalized under the treaty process. So we play a very active role in now the implementation of the treaty. And so it's very busy times, and we're expanding pretty fast. Now, probably all of you are quite familiar with ICAN, but just in case, we are a coalition of other NGOs. And right now we are over 650 NGOs in 112 countries. And that's always expanding, it seems. And these are NGOs of all different sort of sizes and scopes and missions. It includes, of course, WILPF and Peace Action and Veterans for Peace, and a lot of you who are here and who have been some quite actively working on these issues. And for other organizations, it could be just not a core issue. The only thing we ask of the partners is that they agree that they will support the TPNW and that they will operate nonviolently. And so try to make the tent as wide as possible, but it means that not everyone agrees on all other issues, of course. And I think the great success, like I said, you or your institutions have been working on this issue for a long time. And as we all know, it's been going in this meteorically terrible direction for a long time as well. Like the issue of nuclear weapons has only been bad since it was invented. The trajectory of the way the world is going has generally only been scarier. And other independent experts would have always said the same. I mean, if you use, for example, the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists Doomsday Clock, the way they measure it, you see them saying too that we're now closer to the risk of nuclear Armageddon than we have ever been in history, including during the height of the Cold War. And for the same amount of time, basically, for pretty much 7 years, there have been a very strong voice from civil society that the only solution is a total prohibition. The only solution is elimination, which should be brought about by a prohibition. And yet it's taken so very long to make that happen. And now we have it. And the interesting thing to me as well, even from an academic perspective or perhaps a civil rights perspective or, a social justice perspective, is the way in which that did come about after so many decades of people working on this issue and in having so much trouble convincing the armed states, the possessor states, the nuclear armed states, to lead on this, and realizing, in some instances, of course, from a cynical perspective, unsurprisingly, that they would not lead. How are we going to make progress without their leadership? And it was following on the models of these other, what some call these humanitarian disarmament treaties, like the Mine Ban Treaty and the Cluster Munitions Convention, that we realized that the best strategy perhaps is not to try and get through this impenetrable no from these possessor states, but rather go around it and work with the majority of the world that did want to ban nuclear weapons and bring it about over the objections of the possessor states, then working to change the norm and to basically make nuclear weapons not only illegal, but also impractical. And that's the step that we're in now, where, and that's the work that you're doing, in fact, because the thing is, of course, ICAN operates in so many different ways, our giant network, the campaign, ICAN's campaign looks a lot different in, Cote d'Ivoire than it does in Germany and than it does in the US. I think for those who live in and exist in supporter states or states parties, their work is bringing about the ratification of the treaty for that country and the implementation of the treaty's obligations for that country. But if you're in a country like the US, then the work is a lot different, and it's all about using the treaty and to build the norm against nuclear weapons in our country. And that's very hard work, of course. So, I think that the work that you're doing is, and to go through all these, have to go through all these people who don't get it all the time, who don't perceive either the risk or this strategy as a solution, is super hard. And you have to have the same conversations over and over again. So, I salute all of you for doing that work. And of course, we're here with you doing that work, and hoping that we can help provide and supplement the arguments that you need to make with research, with data, and with our general experiences, both from all around the world, and because this has been to some extent a challenge for everyone. It just looks different, I think, in different countries. The cynics and the naysayers are everywhere, even in our supporter countries. There's been so much work that's had to happen and continues to have to happen to convince them that this is the way, this is the path. And that they need to be strong, they need to speak truth to power, they need to do all the things that have been so difficult for so long, continue to be difficult. But I think the exciting part is we are energized by this, by the success that we've had with this treaty. And I think, in this next stage, I think the key is to not, to continue not to accept half measures as some sort of, long-term solution. I think, in our country, well, we all have our separate experiences, I'm sure. But, we, as a nation, love to believe that we have the right way of doing things, and I think it's a challenge for all of us to help our fellow citizens understand that some major adjustments need to be made to preserve our security and to reframe what the word security means for them. And it's so much work to be done. But that brings us to where we are today and how we all got to be talking to each other today, which are these cities appeals, which is just one tool that we have. But the cities appeals really do a lot of that work for us. I think that I've seen them work. I've seen how they work both in the opposed states and in even the supporter states. Because just to say back to the how things are going in the rest of the world, the 190, basically 97 countries that can join the TPNW, even among those that support it, governments don't like to do things in general. They don't like to be proactive. And those are the countries I work with. Most of my work is working with all these countries, not in the US, but not like the countries that are supportive and trying to get them to take the steps to join. And a lot of the times they will ask, like, why, remind me why we should lead on this. And then you have to explain the entire, thesis of the treaty and how it works. But also, why are you bothering us when the possessor states, the ones that have real responsibility to act, are not acting? And therein lies the assistance of the city's appeals in that aspect, because we can say, we are working in those states. We're working assiduously in those possessor states and the nuclear armed states to, especially the ones that are democratic countries. We're working very hard to convince, just to basically like demonstrate that the will of the populace is in fact to join this treaty, and is that most of the country, in particular urban centers, and after all, urban centers should have the loudest voice here, because it's cities that are targeted by nuclear weapons. They have no strategic military function, really. They just exist to city destroyers. And so in these major population centers, all of these people oppose nuclear weapons, and it's very effective for them. And of course, it's very effective with respect to the opposed possessor states as well, because when we talk to those governments, especially the democratic governments, we can say, we have evidence that your country, your citizens oppose nuclear weapons. So in that regard, the city's appeals are a really great tool for us. And that's true also of the parliamentary pledges, and perhaps that's something that I don't know if people know as much about, but the ICAN pledge is kind of a similar concept in a way, but it's basically a tool that we use in nuclear armed states and nuclear client states, the hosting states and NATO states and such, states that consider themselves protected by nuclear weapons, to get parliamentarians in those countries, or Congress people in the US, to say that even though our national government is opposed to the TPNW, that we as parliamentarians pledge to support it and pledge to bring about our country's ratification. That we've had great success with that in some countries, like Italy is, I think, probably our largest percentage of parliamentarians that have joined, but also Germany and a number of other countries. But in the US, it's lagging far behind. So this could be something that I think our partners could work on more. Anyway, I'll pause here. I see a question from Joe. So
yeah, it goes right along, I guess, is what you're saying. When you go to a country, even if, say, the prime minister is very in favor of it, who do you talk to then? Who are you in conversation with?
Right. Yeah, no, I love that, because that's basically what all my work is about. So we're looking at the subset of supportive countries, right, where the government has perhaps voted to adopt the treaty in 2017, or they vote on this annual resolution at the UNGA every year that says that they support the treaty, essentially, but they haven't yet signed or ratified, right? That's what we're talking about. So in those countries, well, each country it depends like what their parliamentary process is like and who we have to talk to in those countries. So for instance, more autocratic countries, there's only a couple of people you do need to talk to. And then in even some less constitutional countries, the decision can be taken by a cabinet. So we might be approaching members of the government only. In most cases, the members of the government can take a decision to sign. So before they sign, we're generally working on ministers at a cabinet level and heads of state. And when we get to the ratification part of the process, that's usually a parliamentary action or congressional action in the US. So then we have to start activating campaigners to work on elected local officials a lot of the time. But it depends. I mean, every country is different, and in some, even in very democratic countries, the ratification process might not actually need like a lot of work on those parliamentarians, because they're going to vote yes when it comes to them. It's more about getting the government to submit it to parliament and so we are intricately, like, I should say that ICAN generally operates in kind of two ways. There's like the public facing work that we're doing, which is all the stuff you might see in the media or social media, and the protests, or getting campaigners to work on things like the city's appeals and things like this. And then there's the kind of behind the scenes, like working with governments. And we have a number of us that are just tracking where the process is in each of these countries and trying to find the right people in each of these governments, whether it's the bureaucrats or the ministers, and go find them and talk to them. Whether it's our campaign, and that also depends. In some of these countries, we have very active campaigners, and in some of them, we have no campaigners. So each one is a super ad hoc, case-by-case basis. Like I just got back from a trip to East Africa, where I was going and meeting with government officials in a few countries where things have not been moving along. And but I wouldn't do that necessarily in a country where we already have all those contacts and things are already on track. But I hope that answers the question. It's like, it's very
thank you.
Yeah. And
Seth, can I ask you, I define this for people and I want to check that I'm right. 92 signatories, but 68 state parties. Can you give us a quick definition of the differences?
Yeah, well, I was starting to talk a bit about signature versus ratification to Joe's question, but yeah, it's this very weird kind of multi-step process that's rather defined by the Vienna Convention, which is sometimes called the Treaty on Treaties, that determines how a country becomes fully bound by a treaty. And then you have this kind of multi-step process. So you, under our treaty, under the TPNW, a country can first, if they wish, sign the treaty, which is, like I said, often a decision taken at the government level. And where they basically, there's not really much of a legal commitment. It's basically, when you sign a treaty, you're basically saying that you have an intent to fully ratify, and that you will at some point, but there's no time limitations on anything. And that in the meantime, you will, you agree not to act to frustrate the purpose of the treaty. Ratification is the process by which you actually become fully bound. And in some countries, in many countries with, with constitutional democracies, especially, that's a parliamentary decision or a congressional decision. So, how the US has like signed a lot of treaties, but hasn't ratified them, including, the CTBT, most relevantly, perhaps, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. And so that's what that process is all about, is like signature being an interim step to ratification. However, there's a caveat, there are a few caveats, but one big one being a country can do both at the same time, a process which is called accession. And often, including especially maybe in our media, people are conflating these terms all over the place. So it's good for our campaigners to understand the distinction, also because you can correct the media sometimes too. But yeah, so with our treaty, we have at this point 68 states parties, meaning that 68 countries have fully joined it, are fully bound by it. But as you say, and we have 92 countries that have signed it. But 3 of the states parties are actually accessions. So that means that we have 92 plus 3, thus 95 countries that have taken some legal action, have either signed or ratified or acceded, which for those of us playing the numbers game, it means that we're quite close, only 4 states away, from having a majority of the world's countries that have the ability to take a treaty action under the UN Charter, that have done so. So we're quite close now to another milestone of being able to say that half the world has taken a treaty action. We say that there are approximately 145 countries that support the treaty. So that's well over 2/3 of the world that support this treaty. Again, some of this, if you want to dig into some of these statistics, and I'm sure some of you are statistics fans, and there's a lot of good content on our website. And then there's also this annual report created by Norwegian People's Aid. It's called the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor, that gives you all of this data. They also make some nice little graphs and such that you can use, and you can cut and paste and put in presentations and such that help make us look like we're all smart and we know everything about the treaty. So I'm happy to talk more about the stats, but all of it's in there. Yeah.
That's great. You said you were in Africa, talking to a few countries in East Africa. What holds them back? Is it a fear of, I'm thinking of Germany too, why don't they just sign on? Is it a fear of hurting relations with the US?
That's one. I think so. Each country that has not joined has their own hodgepodge of reasons, right? But there are some common themes. One is pressure. I think that for our purposes is one of the most noteworthy reasons. And sometimes that pressure is super out there, super explicit. You may recall that under the Trump administration, the US went so far. Well, so the Trump administration was around for the full scope of the treaty's adoption to entry into force. So some of the stuff they did was super public because they, based on their constituencies, they had no issue, I guess, in seeming just in not even pretending to be supportive of nuclear disarmament. So we had Nikki Haley, when she was the permanent representative for the US at the UN, give her statement for the P3, talking about how the US, how this treaty was so dangerous for the world, and basically telling in no uncertain terms that nobody should support it. None of her other colleagues at the UN should support it. To even more extreme, when we were approaching the 50th ratification in October 2020, the Trump administration did something that I think is unprecedented, where they sent letters to the countries that had ratified. So again, not even doing the thing that we know they've been doing, which is quietly pressuring countries not to join, but they were even telling countries that had joined that they should unjoin. Something that I don't even actually know how that would even happen. I don't know if it's ever happened. And I certainly don't know about states, unjoin a treaty before it even entered into force at that point. And I don't know that, that I don't know exactly what they were trying to accomplish, because it was, of course, very ineffective and only helped us speed up the process toward the first 50. But anyway, that's one category, is pressure. And a lot of that pressure, most of it, comes quietly. And important to note that most of it is extremely colonial, extremely racist, extremely duplicative of the global dynamics that we've seen generally represented by, with the entire history of colonialism, but in particular the post-World War II era, where France operates in Francophone states and former colonies to tell them not to join, and Russia operates in its sphere of influence, and the US operates in where its sphere of influence, and basically tries to convince these countries that they should not join. And so that's one category. Another category is, among these supportive states, is capacity. We're talking about a lot of our supporter states are countries with a lot of competing priorities. And joining international treaties isn't at the top of the list a lot of the time. So they may be supportive, but it may be at the bottom of the pile. And so it's about trying to help build their capacity and encourage them to act, and helping them have the tools, to legal tools and otherwise, to take those next steps, which is all very interesting and very satisfying, because you actually, especially when it works, you know that you could help countries do what they wanted to do, and it's just about helping them facilitate the process. And then there are some other, random ad hoc challenges. The question about East Africa, one of the challenges in some of those countries is that they have somewhat, I don't know the right word, but they have leaders who have a particular interest right now they have very strong leaders, let's say, or very that have an interest in something like nuclear energy, and they want to, they don't know what the treaty means for that, and they want to hold off on joining it until they have a better understanding. So they say that they're just studying the treaty. Oftentimes, the answer to your question is all of the above. We see all of these things operating at the same time. And the challenge is to sort of unpack it and find the people who want to do the right thing anyway, and help them do it.
Thank you. Other questions?
I think
Before
George
I jump in with 10 more of my own.
George
Sandy.
has hand raised for a while.
Thanks for noticing. So I'm wondering what the process to winning looks like. Either, from a win backwards, we get a win because we've got these many states to have this many cities or these many actions, or so that's a backwards, how, from the win backwards, or from where we are now. We need so many cities to get the resolution as a city's resolution, and then we do X, and after then we do Y. Walk me through to a win.
Well, I think, George, that from one perspective, they're all wins, and that every city that joins is a huge win, because it builds the case in our country that our country doesn't support nuclear weapons. In terms of the long-term goal, is the total elimination of nuclear weapons. I think that we see that the roadmap, the path, is to first stigmatize, to convince everyone that nuclear weapons aren't protecting them, that they're actually contributing to our insecurity in this world. And again, the city's appeals, the work that you're doing on the local level, is actually how that's going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we're having wins along the way that are tangible and practically meaningful. For example, we can show how the treaty and the first meeting of states parties contribute, even though it's all from states that the P5 might consider not influential in this space, nevertheless had an effect on Putin and on Russia in terms of stigmatizing his nuclear threats that we saw throughout 2022. That the treaty and the first meeting of states parties and the powerful declaration that came out of that first meeting, that was the first multilateral meeting on nuclear weapons that happened since the beginning of Putin's invasion in Russia. And we can show, and I think we'll see more academic articles coming out showing soon, that the TPNW and the little treaty that has, the so-called weaker actors in the world, on the world stage, as parties, was able to have an effect on Putin's threats. Now, that doesn't mean that anyone's out of the woods yet. The problem is nuclear weapons, and the fact that these leaders have it at their momentary will, whether or not they're going to launch, of course, means that we're all in danger until they're eliminated. But I think that is a win that we can point to right on the path. another one totally in a different vein, if that doesn't convince you, is the work happening through the divestment actions that are happening, that I know some of you in some of the city's appeals have worked hard to integrate into the legislative actions, the local legislative actions calling for divestment of public funds from companies that manufacture and maintain nuclear weapons. And I think that, to me, actually, that was when I was first coming into this space, that was the first thing that convinced me the way that divestment initiatives work and could work in this specific case was what convinced me that, oh, this is not a pipe dream, that we can see true meaningful effects right now. Because, I mean, in my opinion, we're ultimately talking about a problem of money. We're ultimately talking about a problem that's, I think, that's exacerbated by capitalism and the fact that the military and nuclear industrial complex. And if we are able to make nuclear weapons less profitable or even unprofitable, then we're not just making nuclear weapons illegal, we're making them irrelevant. And I think that we are well on the path. And if you look at, for example, our Don't Bank on the Bomb reports, I can't do the numbers off the top of my head, but some trillions of dollars that have now been divested from the nuclear weapons industry that cite the TPNW as the reason, that is the roadmap to success, and that is how we get there. You know, in fact, action doesn't change just with international law, right? It doesn't change with just by making the rules. We all know that, as with basically any law, it requires both there to be both something in writing that's a technical prohibition, but also that society needs to buy into it. And I think that we're trying to do both at the same time here. So each of these are successes, but perhaps even more major successes than you might immediately perceive, because you know, I think when you get to the win, the final win, you don't even, it just sort of sneaks up on you. And again, a lot of you have engaged in this kind of work a lot longer than I have, but if I can point to specifically the Cluster Munitions Convention. So the Cluster Munitions Convention was another treaty that possessor states had fought kicking and screaming, you know, the whole way, and said they'll never join and it will never apply to them. The US, which is the largest producer of cluster munitions, it made many a statement during its negotiation that, okay, the goal is laudable, but it was an impractical way to get there, and thus they couldn't, you know, fully join it. And yet it was the market that ultimately has brought about the effectiveness of the Cluster Munitions Convention. Not to say that cluster munitions are totally eliminated, but there's been a ton of progress in terms of getting there, and we're essentially eliminated. And in fact, the last producer of cluster munitions, Textron in Rhode Island in 2016, shuttered that part of its business because citing the CMC, the convention, as the reason, saying that it's no longer profitable for them to make it. And it was represented more risk than reward. So I think that some of these things may not be always like on the front of our minds as we're like in the spaces of our city councils or talking to our neighbors on the street. But this is the way we see actually the wins coming and the effectiveness of this prohibition, this international prohibition, even in those spaces where everyone thinks that we're a joke, you know, like perhaps in your city councils, you know, that where you hear a lot of probably people who just couldn't possibly get it. It's going to take so long for them to understand it because it's not in their mind space that this could have any effect on them or on the US, but it can.
Thank you. Sandy?
Yes. I know there's a House Resolution 77, and I wondered, has the Biden administration made any comment about this TPNW?
Yeah, so There have been some comments from the Biden administration. They're still working on their NPR's sort of specific perspective. They say in general that they don't support it still, and that they don't see it as a plausible route to nuclear disarmament. However, they have also walked back some of the vitriol from the prior administration, and they've said that, for instance, that the U.S. will no longer ask states not to sign and ratify it. And I think that that's represents, it's hard to see some of these things as progress when the status is still bad. But I think that these do represent sort of a path and a movement from the administration. And we know some of the leading people in Biden's appointees that work on arms control and non-proliferation, that they have in their prior civilian lives, while they've written very positive things about the treaty. So we see a way to have an effect on the Biden administration yet. I wrote a piece in the Columbia Journal of International Affairs, like basically analyzing Biden's past on nuclear weapons and talking about how, that they needed to end the opposition to the treaty. And not to say that that was influential or anything, but I think I've been thinking about how it kind of marks a way forward for them. Oh, there was a first part of your question that I meant to answer. I can't remember now. Sandy.
House Resolution 77.
Oh, yeah. Right. So 77, I guess those of you probably know it. So there are two bills that reference the TPNW that are in Congress. The second one just got released last week. So there's House Resolution 77, which is something like embracing the goals and provisions of the TPNW, and is sort of resembles the Back from the Brink platform, kind of these 5 planks of moving towards nuclear disarmament. It doesn't call on the U.S. to sign and ratify the TPNW, and I guess that's the distinction with the Eleanor Holmes Norton bill, which just was introduced last week. And that's, what is that? That's something, hang on a second. I forget the number for that one, but I can look it up maybe. Well, anyway, this is the one, it's something like 2775, but that may not be right exactly. But this one, oh, it is 2775. Yeah, I'm impressed. I remember that. Okay, so that one is is the Eleanor Holmes Norton's Nuclear Abolition and Economic Conversion Act, I think is that one is called. And it does call on the U.S. to sign and ratify the TPNW. Both are great. Both were introduced in similar, they looked a little different, but similar versions of it did not seem like they were going to ever get to that magic number of whatever it is, like 280 whatever of co-sponsors that would give it a shot at actually getting a vote or coming out of committee. But that's not to say they're not meaningful. Just as the city's appeals too, we talk about those bills as indicating that there is support. And I think along with the parliamentary pledge, that is certainly something that campaigners in the US can and should ask for. If you support this treaty, sign the pledge and also, co-sponsor these bills. I should say that I think that in the last Congress, if I'm not mistaken, the Back from the Brink bill, which is now HR 77, got 12 co-sponsors, and that the Eleanor Holmes Norton bill, which in this session is HR 2775, got 14 co-sponsors. So, and much of them overlap. in terms of the support. So I think a lot of work to be done there. And, that is definitely, I think the asks this year for members of Congress, if I had to, and sometimes I do meet with members of Congress, and I think the priorities would be, join the pledge, co-sponsor those bills, and also come to the second meeting of states parties, where other parliamentarians will be showing up in November to express their support for the treaty, are the parliamentarians from non-supportive states, that is. And they'll, as they did in the first meeting of states parties, but there were no US representatives there, to issue a statement at the end that's calling for and building the network of supportive legislators around the world to get their countries to join. And I think it would be, the US Congress people, even the ones that support it, I guess they had a bit of an excuse for the first meeting of states parties being in Vienna, but this year it's in New York, and I think they can all take the train.
Mike.
Yeah. I hope they'll be there.
I started to ask a question about penalties for breaking the treaty, and then I think you said that no one had unjoined yet in one of your comments. And that leads to the comment you made about no losses. And one thing I wanted to compliment ICAN on was the way you structured it, such that just by bringing up the subject in a city council meeting, you're pushing that community forward. And so congratulations on that. So there are no losses in this process.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I could imagine losses. The losses that are meaningful to us are people dying, I think, and environments being destroyed. And that's the way we're ultimately going to measure our success, is whether we think that this treaty at some point is the only way to go. That's the only realistic solution to getting us to a safer world. The question to me is, our country is going to join it before or after there's a great disaster. And so I think that, to your point, like, every step along that process to getting them to join, apart from a great humanitarian disaster, is a win. That's, to me, it's about convincing people with hope rather than fear, too, like that we're trying to build a world where we can point them to the solutions before the problem has to be exacerbated, So to one of your points, yes, I think that that the city's appeals are all great wins, and even when they are technically losses because there's maybe a vote that we lose, it's still a win, as you say, because we're raising awareness and showing people that in a country where the media doesn't talk about this as a solution in any serious way, we're sensitizing people on the local level to the fact that they should be thinking about this as a solution. Many people do. To the point about whether states can, or how you enforce, or how you can actually deal with violations under the treaty. This is a challenge, of course, under all international treaties. There's no global police force to enforce any treaties. Instead, what we have is a system where governments, through their meetings, come together to address violations, and through any number of means. I mean, it could result in armed conflict, but that's obviously not the idea. In fact, rather, it's a lot of negotiation, diplomacy, and if it comes to it, sanctions, various kinds. That would be the way that most these treaties address violations. Now, there's no prescriptive element of the treaty that defines how these states have to deal with it. It just says that they have to meet to make a plan. And this is the best we have. I mean, under global society, under law, this is the best we've come up with. And I don't know that there's any other way to do that, really, because but I think on large, it's been successful. And again, I think that if we come to the space where we've generally eliminated arsenals, I think we're in a much stronger position anyway to negotiate from there and to continue to enforce some transgressions. And then as to the last part that you were saying about with countries with no one's yet withdrawn, well, that's actually going to be quite a challenge to withdraw anyway for a country to do that. And again, we are just following all treaty law and the Vienna Convention and the dictates of it. We just make it actually even harder than the default rules because they can't withdraw during armed conflict, but they can otherwise. Of course, every state has a sovereign right to withdraw from a treaty, as states have done under the NPT as well, the dominant paradigm under nuclear weapons. Oh, sorry, Anne, you're talking, but you're muted. Still, I think.
Yeah. Any other questions you want to ask? I want to say, I hope you continue to be patient in these cities appeals because they take forever. Joe told me he had to leave early, and I think Sandy did too, but just the roundabout to get an appointment to, it can take a year and a half, as it did in Durham, which is a slam dunk of a city for this.
Yeah.
So just be patient, keep the campaign going. And maybe we'll chat a bit afterwards, but before we stop the recording, I want to thank you for taking the time to explain so clearly and to fill us in, because I think we've learned a lot today. So thanks very much.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for having me. And yeah, we're both impatient and patient at the same time. I mean, like, that we're operating, and the shift in the narrative has been about people acting who can't wait any longer. And at the same time, we're well aware that people take time to make processes happen. And we're even more aware that even, look at this treaty, I mean, that's been advanced by this majority of the world's countries that have all supported nuclear disarmament, as 90% of the world says they do, approximately. And yet it still took 70 years for them to get to this treaty. So, and it's taking a long time for them to sign and ratify, the treaty, because the reality is that even when you're fully supportive, systems take a long time. But, I have found that with the cities appeals, you never know. I mean, some of these cities, we've had cities even in the US that have joined the cities appeal by some mayoral declaration. Like somebody met with the mayor and they said, oh, we should join that. And there's no city council process. And then we've had some that are mired in bizarre politics of whatever localities.
Mm-hmm.
New York, I worked on New York City's appeal forever. And we're very proud of it, but it took forever, it took years and massive campaigning and showing up at every city council meeting for years. So, it's just, we know that it can sometimes be hard, and we also know that sometimes it can be bizarrely easy, but we celebrate all of them. And just knowing that in the people behind the scenes sometimes, had to put in insane amounts of work or got lucky, and that's just what it is.
Thanks so much, George. You can stop the recording now if you would.